Good evening, everyone. Could you please take a seat so we can get started? Dear Rector Hoch, dear Ms. Al-Rihawi, dear Christiane Fröhlich, dear Konrad Schetter, dear Tamiris Fakouri, dear participants of the 5th Conference of the Network for Forced Migration Studies. It's my honor to welcome you all today on behalf of the organizing committee to this important conference. We began the journey of organizing this event over a year ago. And now we have finally come together today in this beautiful historical lecture hall of the University of Bonn to kick off the conference. This is indeed a very moving moment for me and my whole team, who have worked tirelessly, especially in the last weeks, to make this conference happen. The team at the Bonn International Centre for Conflict Studies, BIC, organized the conference for the Network of Forced Migration Studies in close cooperation with the Executive Board of the network, the European Coalition of Migrants and Refugees, EU-COMA, and the project Forced Migration and Refugee Studies, Networking and Knowledge Transfer, FFVT. We are specifically happy that with EU-COMA, we have for the first time a refugee-led organization formally involved in the organization of the conference. I also would like to thank Professor Tamiris Fakouri that she will present the keynote of the conference today and that she traveled all the way from Boston to be with us tonight and for the next 2 days. Thank you for that. Let me present some statistics to you. 411 participants have registered for the conference. 353 have registered for participation and presence, and 58 for online participation. 285 participants come from Germany, 126 from another 52 countries in total. These are very impressive numbers and an indication how important the conference is not only for Germany, but also for international scholars working on forced migration topics and issues. I'm happy to announce that we received support and funding from numerous organizations and institutions, which I would like to name now and list for you. We are first of all very thankful that the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, BMBF, provided again funding for the conference. The University of Bonn is hosting the conference at its historical main building, which has given us the opportunity to offer space for altogether 75 sessions. The Sparkassen Foundation Cologne Bonn co-funds the catering, which allowed us to keep registration fees low. Gerda-Henkel Foundation, the German Foundation for Peace Research, and the German Institute for Global Area Studies provided funding for 40 stipends for scholars from the Global South and Europe to attend the conference in person. In addition, we received financial support from the University of Applied Sciences and the Transdisciplinary Research Area, individuals, institutions, and societies of the University of Bonn. We are specifically grateful that the Mayor of Bonn, Ms. Katja Dörner, will host the reception of the opening ceremony in the building of the Old Town's Hall, even though, unfortunately, she cannot be present tonight with us. Without the support of these partners and contributors, this conference would not have been possible. So I'm really thankful for all the support we received in the last months and weeks. I will now lead you through the first part of the evening, which are the words of welcome by the host of the University of Bonn and the organizers of the conference, Ms. Al-Rihawi, Dr. Fröhlich on behalf of the Network for Forced Migration Research Studies, and Professor Schetter on behalf of BIC and FFVT. Unfortunately, Professor Ine had to cancel his participation last minute, but sends his greetings as well to all of you. The second part of the evening will be the keynote lecture by Professor Fakouri, and Niyima Yadama from EU-COMA will lead you through the discussion and the keynote. So with that, I would like to ask Professor Schetter, first we have a video greeting from the State Chancellor, Dr. Roland Filippi from the Ministry for Science and Education. He unfortunately cannot be with us tonight, but he sent a video greeting which we can now listen to, please.
Mayor Dörner, Professor Hoch, Professor Ine, Miss Al-Riavi, Ms. Dr. Fröhlich, Professor Schetter, honored guests. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the opening event of the 5th conference of the German Network for Forced Migration Studies. Forced migration and displacement have been continually at the rise for many years. At the same time, right-wing populist voices against immigration and people seeking protection are gaining more and more attention and influence in many countries. Opinion polls show that the rapid rise of the far right, immigration and refugee policies are the issues that worry the people in Germany the most. Forced migration as a consequence of violent conflict, natural disasters, and persecution is the challenge for society and policymakers. Academic research plays a decisive role in overcoming these challenges. It provides a scientifically grounded basis for societal and political discussions regarding forced migration and refugees. Over the next 2 days, we will welcome the entire spectrum of migration and displacement research here in Bonn to take a step away from heated current debates and discuss the background and context of forced migration and displacement. Questions about which strategies have become established in dealing with the challenges of forced migration and displacement, which measures can improve education opportunities for young refugees, or which factors have proven themselves to be helpful in integrating refugees into the labor market, will be discussed not only between academics, but together with practitioners. This dialogue between research and practice is a key instrument for bringing scientific findings to a wider audience. This dialogue is also a key element of the German Network for Forced Migration and Refugee Studies, which has been supported by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research since 2020. Our funding aims to strengthen the structures of German forced migration and refugee studies, build networks, and expand research internationally. And we are delighted that the network has received a positive evaluation and that the project will therefore enter into a second funding phase starting next year and lasting for another 5 years. Finally, I would like to congratulate the conference organizers for putting together such a diverse program. I hope you all enjoy a productive and inspiring conference.
Thank you. Sorry, I got a bit irritated because we changed the order of speakers just 5 minutes before this opening. So with that, I would like to call Christiane Fröhlich to the floor.
Dear Professor Hoch, dear Maarit Thiem, dear Shaza Al-Rihawi, dear State Secretary Filippi, dear Konrad Schetter, dear fellow researchers, ladies and gentlemen. In the name of the Executive Board of the Network for Forced Migration Studies, welcome to our 5th conference. Let me first express my gratitude. It's a lot of visible and invisible work to organize an event of this size. So I want to thank Maarit Thiem and all her team for organizing the conference this year. There will be presents, I promise, after the last session on Wednesday, but please join me in a round of applause for them now. I'm also grateful to our many sponsors this year, especially FFVT, the Gerda-Henkel Foundation and the German Foundation for Peace Research, for their substantial financial support. The title of the conference is Regional and Local Responses to Global Refugee Movements. And frankly, we couldn't have imagined how timely the topic would be. Around the world, refugee movements are growing, as are unfortunately anti-migrant sentiments and politics. I'm all the more grateful that the following days will see meaningful research-based exchange on displacement, asylum, integration, and other aspects of a phenomenon as old as humanity. And I'm particularly happy that this year the number of people with lived experience of displacement included in the organization of the conference as participants and commentators is higher than ever before. We direly need their voices, perspectives, and expertise, so thank you especially for being here. And now I look forward to the keynote speech as well as the exchange with you and the panels and roundtables and coffee breaks, of course, in the next days, and wish us all a good conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiane. Shaza, can I call you to the floor? Shaza Al-Riai, she is the chairperson of EU COMA, as I said before, one of the co-organizers of this conference.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm really happy to have you all here. Thank you for your coming. Before I start, I would like you all to imagine this journey, a long, difficult path filled with suffering, abuse, and violence, closed borders, raising anti-immigration sentiment, and also ever-present threats of being labeled as illegal, will face you to be in a desperate path. Endless walking, detention center, and constant exploitation became your reality. Finally, reaching new country, a new community with a mixed perception will also let you help to have a future and chance to rebuild your life. This is the reality of many refugees, and I want you to just keep it in your mind while you're discussing and negotiating and trying to work during these 2 days. Yet, amidst of the growing hospitalities and shrinking options, there is a spirit of resilience, determination to build a better future against all odds. As Amela Calder once said, a refugee is someone who survived and who can be and create the future. So instead of looking at refugees and forced people, migrants, as a burden, try to see them as opportunities and as an investment. As a refugee-led organization, we are happy today to be co-organizing. I think this is the first time where academia and the kind of institution work together with the refugees, because we believe that the meaningful refugee participation is one of the keys that we need to think about it and to put it in our agenda once we are talking about their lives and trying to design the life of refugees. No one can do things without them, so nothing about us without us. The European Coalition of Migrants and Refugees committed to empowering refugees and migrants in the participation and decision-making process. Also, as a refugee myself, I feel like it's really important, and I saw how it's changed the whole policies where we are involved, the innovative solution that comes from those lived experience people. They have a lot. We have to look at them as an opportunities, as a skilled people, as people who have a lot of resilience until he became here as a member, as a person in the community. So I can bring my lived experience to be also one of the motive for our new community, and this is help in the integrations. For us, I urge everyone to participate in the open and honest discussion share their experience, and contribute to developing more inclusive and justice society for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaza, for your words. Professor Konrad Schetter, may I call you to the floor? Professor Schetter is director of BIC, the Bonn International Centre for Conflict Studies, and also project leader of the FFVT project.
Dear Michael Hoch, dear Shaza Al-Rihawi, dear Christiane Fröhlich, dear colleagues and friends. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here in Bonn at the University of Bonn to the 5th conference of the German Network for Forced Migration Studies. I feel that this conference is taking place at the right time and in the right place. I think we can't have this conference without talking about politics. I think in the recent months, the question of how to deal with refugees and asylum seekers has become the overarching political issue in Germany. It is also one that German citizens consider to be most pressing. The recent elections in 2 German federal states, Saxony and Thuringia, showed that the right-wing and demagogic political parties won the majority of the votes. The debates over how to deal with refugees was the main topic in these elections. After these elections, the federal government reacted immediately. Almost all political parties seemed to agree on the need for more restrictions for refugees, thus catering to the demands of right-wing parties. What is worrying, however, is that in this debate, refugee policy is being mixed up with other political themes, such as public security, integration, migration, or the collapse of the social services. It seems that refugees have become the scapegoat for everything that is going wrong in Germany. Here, in my eyes, politicians are playing with fire. Unfortunately, there is no differentiation or separate debate on each of these themes, neither in politics nor in media. The voices of academia are also seldom heard in such debates. That is why I believe that this conference, with more than 400 participants, comes at the right time and provides a very strong signal. I deeply thank all of you for coming here to Bonn for this conference. It is important that we as academics show on this conference that research is able to provide a deeper understanding of forced migration, and particularly the situation of refugees in Germany, in Europe, as well as in the global south. Moreover, this debate on refugees in Germany highlights the extent to which many European countries, not only in Germany, are inward-looking only and unable to see the bigger picture. In the recent debates, it is ignored that thousands of people die in the Mediterranean Sea every year. It is ignored that Europe is a destination of only a fraction of all refugees. It is ignored that countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Kenya, Uganda, or Pakistan have to deal with many more refugees than Europe. And it is ignored that refugees are fleeing violent conflicts that cannot be separated from global politics in which European countries are also deeply involved. It is therefore time to discuss the dimensions and patterns of forced migration. We need discussions in academia, in the media, and in politics that forced migration does not stop at the borders of Germany or the European Union. As already mentioned, the German Federal Ministry for Education and Research, the BMBF, understood this need for research and knowledge transfer quite in forced migration studies as early as 1 decade ago. We are grateful for this. This is why the ministry initiated a project, as we call it FFVT, Flucht- und Flüchtlingsforschung, Vernetzung und Transfer, Forced Migration and Refugee Studies, Networking and Knowledge Transfer. FFVT is carried out by the Institute for Migration Studies and Intercultural Studies of the University of Osnabrück, IMES, the German Institute for Development Studies and for Sustainability, IDOS, the Center for Human Rights, Erlangen, Nuremberg, Krenn, and my own institute, the Bonn International Centre for Conflict Studies. The aim of this project is to bring together researchers in the field of forced migration to strengthen research in forced migration studies and to internationalize German networks on forced migration and to transfer this knowledge to the public. And I hope that this voice here from Bonn, from this conference, will be heard in public. In co-organizing this conference, we hope not only to bring together researchers working on forced migration, but also to show the complexity, the multifacets of this field, where simple political answers are difficult to find. I wish us all a fruitful but also an inspiring and compelling discussions. Research thrives on controversies and on listening to each other. I'm sure that this fifth conference of the German Network for Forced Migration Studies will provide this ground. I will close by my thanks, which going to the University of Bonn for providing the space here, to the Netzwerk Flüchtlingsforschung, and of course to the wonderful team here at BIC which organized this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Schetter. With that, I would like to ask Rector Hoch up here, and would like also to thank you one more time again for offering us to have this conference in this building, because this is really amazing, and we're really looking forward to spending the next 2 days in this beautiful environment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear colleagues, dear participants, speakers. A warm welcome at the University of Bonn. This is one of two castles that are the university's castles. The main castle, it has to be renovated. You may see it. It will take 10 years or so, the renovation. So most of the groups here moved out already, but we are pretty optimistic that we can return, but 10 years, this is a long time. Now, this has been the former theater. After World War II, this was the theater of the city. So this is why it has been renovated too. It looks a little odd because all the speakers are like 10, 20 centimeters away from falling down the stage. But we will try to fix this, maybe another time. So I'd like to welcome you in the university. The university was founded 1818, so it's more than 200 years ago, by a Prussian king that wanted to make a university a present to the Catholic Rhineland. This was when Napoleon was defeated here from the Prussian troops, and then the Prussian government was making the university a present to the Rhineland. Now the Rhineland was Catholic. So this is why at the very beginning of the university, there were almost no students, and it was not accepted, this university, in the environment. But only after a while, after 10 or 20 years, the number of students raised. So a very interesting history, because the university was founded as a reform university. So we have two faculties of theology, one is Catholic and one Protestant, which is unusual. So anyway, so a little bit to the history. So the university is a large university in Germany, so we have like 50,000 members. So among them, like 42 or so students. So this includes undergraduate, graduate students, PhD students, and around 8,000 or so people from staff, professors, and so forth. So we're quite huge, So the university interacts quite well with outer university institutions. So this includes the BIC, for example, of Konrad Schetter. He's also a professor at the university, so we have many joint professorships with outer university institutions. So this includes also IDOS. And so when, Konrad was mentioning that it would be interesting to have your network come here, to have a conference, of course, we all work together. The Bonn Research Alliance, you know, as has already been introduced, consisting of several institutions, work together. And in a way, I'd like to thank Frau Thiem, but also the other colleagues for making this possible here. Bonn is the birthplace of Beethoven. You know this? I guess not, huh? You thought Beethoven is born in Vienna, but it's not true. In fact, he was living here like until the age of 19. He was born here and lived here until the age of 19. And as a neuroscientist, you know that it is here that his brain has formed. His genius has been developed, you know. His enthusiasm, his, how to say, his potency in terms of his composer life has been formed here. And then he went to Vienna and died. And so this is something, of course, for the Bonn people is very important. So if you have the opportunity, please visit the Beethoven Museum. It has been renewed a couple of months ago. It's really fantastic to go there. You can even see the DNA, the genome of Beethoven, because there has been sequenced. The genome of Beethoven, I don't know whether you have heard this. There were a couple of hairs that they could recover, and in fact, you know, with the next generation sequencing methods, it was possible to sequence the genome. So nothing spectacular has come out from this. I think he had a liver disease, you know, and other things which people knew already. But this was more like because people drank a lot of alcohol in the past, I guess, because there was no, you know, the water, there was no hygiene, you know, for water and so forth. So I'd like to close to, you know, and become a little bit more serious. I was really touched by your introduction. And it's true what you were saying. It's something, namely, you know, that we have maybe to do, you know, more often in the future, namely to have refugee organizations combined with academia, and so that, you know, that the different viewpoints can come together, and so that we can become more productive. So thank you really for giving your speech, and I'm very happy, of course, that Dr. Fröhlich and the German network, yes, of forced migration research is basically part of the organization committee. And Konrad, thank you very much, you know, for that the BIC organizes this. I wish you a very open discussion and a fruitful discussion. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Professor Hoch. We've now come to the end of the first part of the evening. Before I hand over to Nijima for the second part, for the keynote and discussion, I just wanted to highlight, you probably have noticed this is the only keynote we have, so this is a bit different to the other conferences. But there will be another session when we will all come together, have the chance to come together. That is the end of the conference on Wednesday at 5:30, and I'm happy to announce that EU COMA took over the responsibility to organize the closing session, which is a great opportunity for us all to learn from our refugee participants in the conference, because there will be a short discussion of academics with refugee background on the conference, but also of 3 journalists who themselves have also forced migration background to reflect on the conference and the different perspectives. So I would already like to invite you to the closing. It will also take place here on Wednesday at 5:30. And now we come to the second part, to the keynote. After the keynote, we all walk together to the Old Mayor's Hall. It's about 3 minutes walk. Just follow us, and then you get food and drinks over there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Maarit. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and honored guests, all here seated, welcome to the long-awaited keynote session on the topic that would actually not be more pertinent in our increasingly complex world, dubbed Invincible Geographies of Refugees, Context, Challenges, and Solutions. We are privileged to have with us Tammy Race, an eminent scholar whose work has significantly shaped our understanding of politics, of refugees, migration, and post-conflict governance. Tammy Race's extensive research has shed light on the often overlooked or marginalized spaces of refugees and the policies that governed them. Her insights, as you would also learn from her keynote, invite us to critically examine the global refugee regime and the hierarchies it creates, challenging us to think about refugee spaces, not just as destinations or transit points, but as complex, dynamic geographies shaped by a myriad of factors, policy, personal agency, and the often invincible forces of global politics. As we navigate through her 40 to 45 minutes keynote speech, followed by a discussion, of course an open discussion, we will also explore how these invincible geographies impact the life of lived experiences of displaced individuals and the broader policy frameworks intended to address their needs. We will as well delve into how certain spaces of refugees become visible or marginalized, the role of knowledge and policy infrastructures in this process, and what these hidden geographies can teach us about the assumptions that underline contemporary refugee policies. Without further ado, which I already did, it is my great pleasure to welcome Tammy Race Fakori, who traveled all the way from US, as Maarit said, to join us for her keynote. Welcome, Tammy Race.
Dear esteemed colleagues, dear all, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted and honored to be here. I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the organizers, the German Network for Forced Migration Studies, BIC, EU Comar, and the University of Bonn for their invitation and for making this possible. So my name is Tammy Race Fakhouri, and I'm based at the Fletcher School at Tufts. My research is about the governance of displacement in the international system and the agency of first host states in the global refugee regime. I also work on the dilemmas of peace and inclusive governance in post-war societies. So this keynote is inspired by my field reflections, conversations with scholars, grassroots actors, refugee organizations, and international organizations in the last decade. And I'm really humbled and grateful by this to this opportunity. So my keynote unpacks the politics of research and policy knowledge on refugee hosting geographies. Much work has already interrogated the geopolitics of making and unmaking refugees. Research has also criticized the politics of uneven sovereignties and ethno-racial hierarchies that shape refugees' welfare and rights. So in this keynote, building on the footsteps of many great scholars who have done so before me, I would like to contribute to this debate by interrogating the infrastructures of knowledge and policy that construct the politics of mapping refugee hosting geographies. I approach this task not as a cartographic exercise, but as a discursive and deeply politicized one. I will explore how policy expectations, as well as research assumptions, position geographies of refuge on the global map, making them visible or invisible, highlighting or obscuring knowledge about their contexts and challenges. In doing so, I hope to offer a modest contribution to the debate on pluralizing spaces of refuge, as well as knowledge and non-knowledge on refuge. I will draw on geopolitics, critical geopolitics, as a complex field that invites us to rethink how ideas and policy and legal imaginaries construct and script places. The aim is to question assumptions about East, West, center, margins, the modern, the archaic. This perspective also invites us to probe into the origins of geopolitical representations and narratives. Who utters these narratives and for what purpose? In this regard, I will approach refugee hosting geographies not as given geographical contexts, but as deeply politicized ones. The idea for revisiting knowledge on spaces of refuge emerged in a series of field research missions and workshops I participated in during the last years since the onset of large-scale displacement from Syria. I was based back then in Beirut. In a literature review spanning the last years, we noticed a pronounced empirical focus on refugee hosting states like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, as well as certain EU member states that have set up hotspots and refugee camps to host displaced Syrians, such as Greece, or that have welcomed Syrian refugee communities like Germany and Sweden. Research has also extended to traditional resettlement countries, such as Canada and the USA. This literature is invaluable, but our interviews and field conversations documented a far wider universe of places and spaces to which refugees fled. Some examples that were mentioned at the time, and they are of course random, these examples include Japan, Russia, Cyprus, Luxembourg, Finland, Tunisia, Sudan, and surprisingly, the Gaza Strip, of course, before the October 7 events. So with few notable exceptions, we noticed that there is a dearth of research on these locations and the multiple meanings these destinations have had for displaced individuals. Many of our respondents also invited us to go beyond the state-centric view and to center different localities, including informal and makeshift spaces, as host geographies in their own right. So this observation was really like an invite to probe conceptually about what defines typical versus atypical locations for certain refugee communities. The criteria that shape policy interests in certain location choices over others, and the reasons guiding researchers' reliance on certain case studies over others to understand the politics of refugee hosting. Is it the number of refugees that a country hosts that makes it receive considerable attention? Is it policymakers' security and strategic interests that put certain spaces of refuge in the limelight? I do not aim to give conclusive answers to these complex questions. Rather, my presentation seeks to interrogate the politics of hierarchy that casts certain places of refuge as off the radar, policy irrelevant, or not central enough to our research agenda. So some of the questions that I will address are, first, how do knowledge and policy infrastructures position spaces of refuge on the global map? Why do some spatialities of refuge garner significant attention, and under what criteria, and according to whose perspectives and whose standards? Second, how does the current global refugee regime shape hierarchies of refugee hosting destinations, and how might this affect refugees' welfare and the everyday work of refugee organizations? Third, how do refugees as actors in their own right destabilize this politics of hierarchy? Fourth, how do refugees' choices of destinations invite us to rethink assumptions about displacement and embrace instead non-linear thinking? Finally, how can we look at invisible geographies of refuge as sites of theorization rather than mere providers of empirical examples? So within the next 35-40 minutes, I will examine the infrastructures of policy and knowledge on spaces and places of refuge, as well as the dilemmas they present for our own research agenda and the everyday experiences of refugees and refugee organizations. At the same time, I will explore how the dynamic field of refugee and forced migration studies has addressed and redressed numerous biases and assumptions, offering alternatives to scripting geographies of refuge. Finally, I will share some takeaways. So how are spaces of refuge made visible or invisible? Let me just lay the ground. In one of his seminal keynote presentations, Stefan Kassel says, and here I quote, "Research on forced migration has always been close to practical and policy concerns. In fact, it's often policy-driven. That is, its research questions, methods, and even findings are shaped by the political interests of governments and funding bodies." He invites us, however, to seek ways out of these dilemmas. So I would like to build on this call by looking specifically at how the intimate connections between research and policy limit our research agenda and how we can seek a way out of this. So it's widely acknowledged that analytical categories that developed out of state-centric and Western-centric experiences have shaped refugee and migration scholarship, as well as the way we classify spaces of refuge within the global refugee regime. There's an overproduction of research on migration from the south to northern destinations. Also, knowledge production has been significantly influenced by the coloniality of power, the security frameworks of influential states, as well as research funding priorities. Here, the notions of core versus hidden geographies are central to understanding how policy and knowledge render people along their journeys invisible. In agenda setting, there's a divide between what is deemed as central versus peripheral, policy relevant versus policy irrelevant, time-sensitive, urgent, or critical versus deferrable. When we look at the speciality of refuge, this divide articulates itself in various ways, presenting various conceptual and analytical dilemmas. So there's a voluminous literature on the determinants under which asylum seekers seek refuge to high-income countries. There's also much literature on how the global north externalizes border control to first host countries in the south. This has led to the dominance of the externalist perspective, where certain refugee hosting destinations are looked as receptacles or extensions of global powers' externalization agendas. Even if there is increasingly more research on the South, we know less about how first host countries in the many global South shape the politics of refuge as subjects rather than objects of inquiry, and as geographies from where we can theorize on migration rather than provide empirical examples. Furthermore, the modern refugee regime has enshrined a certain legal vision of what refugee hosting looks like, what B.S. Chimney calls the positivist perspective on refugee hosting. This has arguably concealed knowledge on destinations that do not conform to normative conceptualizations of asylum. This has also led to a disconnect between legal studies on asylum and refugee studies that sought to break away from this legalistic view on asylum. It's not only about research. According to some of my interviews, during the negotiations on the Global Compact for refugees, Middle Eastern countries have asked that the international refugee regime gives more visibility to their traditions on open borders, hospitality, charity, and faith-based humanitarianism. Adding to this, the focus on durable solutions has significantly shaped assumptions about refugees' location choices. For a long time, as I've just said, there has been this classical emphasis on determinants of asylum destinations that are guiding the choices of people on the move. Examples are employment policies, welfare, recognition rate of refugees, etc. This has certainly influenced the hypotheses, choices of data sets, and expectations on refugee destinations in our academic research. So a destination might be cast as atypical if it departs from typical determinants of asylum. This is especially true in the literature on pull factors that looks at how asylum seekers strategically plan their way to high-income countries. This classical focus may have also limited interest in theorizing messy and complex refugee hosting responses that do not conform to clear-cut typologies. This is, however, changing, and I will take stock of various conceptual innovations later on. Let me just emphasize that it's not only about the West versus the rest. It's also about what scholars define as the fixation of the international refugee regime on certain places. So scholars have flagged how over-researching refugee spaces on which the humanitarian order is fixated, such as the Kakuma camp or the Zaatari camp in Jordan, leads not only to research fatigue, but also to concealing knowledge on other refugee communities and their plight. A seminal article has also looked at how researchers are drawn to certain refugee destinations, such as the Palestinian Shatila refugee camp in Beirut, exoticizing them as conflict-affected ethnographic sites. Work has also flagged how historically migration scholarship has rested on binary logics of spatiality, including this duality between the center, such as large cities, and the margins, such as informal settlements. The strategic destination for refugees versus temporary stopovers. So our research in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey suggests that there has been fixation on certain cities, refugee camps, in both the research and policy landscape, overlooking some neighborhoods and informal settlements where refugees have felt invisible. So considering that funding priorities of organizations and donor programs have a significant impact on forced migration studies, it's not surprising that certain places of refuge receive more policy and research attention while others recede in the background. So how does policy bring certain places of refuge into focus and conceals others? So not all countries serving as places of refuge lie within the circumference of the policy circle, garnering immediate attention. Border externalization policies of powerful states have targeted some refugee hosting countries earlier and much more than others, making them right into the focal point of interest and positioning them as highly critical and time-sensitive. Central to this claim is how powerful political actors draw on geographical proximity and remoteness to govern migration. The architecture of repulsion is multifaceted, but controlling borderlands that host large number of refugees is at the heart of states' deterrence strategy. One mechanism I have been studying lies in outsourcing non-departure by building the resilience of first host states that lie in the proximity of powerful actors. A case in point is, of course, the EU in its so-called neighborhood and how it prioritizes the management of migration and refuge with select nearby countries such as Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya. So geographical proximity is crucial to how the EU may prioritize a first host destination as a target for border externalization, yet this goes beyond physical borders. It's also about how the EU ranks geographies of refuge through discursive practices and policy imaginaries. Within its own borderlands, the EU differentiates certain geographies from others through rationalities guided by crisis governance. So during the so-called 2015 refugee crisis, the EU has developed a toolbox of policy instruments with select first host countries such as Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan deemed as priority partners, either because of the size of the refugee community the country hosts, the perceived level of migration threat they pose to EU borders, or the host country's readiness to play the role of a gatekeeper. Prior to this, places of refuge such as Lebanon were no privileged policy stakeholders. So by 2024, amidst significant displacement in its neighborhood, the EU signed a series of migration packages with Egypt, Mauritania, and Lebanon, positioning these deals as time-sensitive for stability in a turbulent region. Thus, we can see how EU crisis governance rationalities construct certain spaces of refuge into zones of interest, while others fade into the background. Indeed, though they are close, according to our research, geographies that have historically received fewer refugees or migrants and that have not been geopolitical hotspots for the EU, such as Western Sahara or Mauritania, prior to the 2024 deal, these places have not prominently figured on the EU's geopolitical agenda. Of course, the EU is just one example out of many. Australia has privileged cooperation with Indonesia, while the US has turned the gaze to its neighbor, Mexico, as a strategic gatekeeper. Examples abound. But what I wanted to say is that it's not only about proximity. The UK and Denmark have recently spatialized Rwanda into a remote location of asylum. It's then understandable, perhaps, that geographies of refuge, which count to influential actors as gatekeepers or potential sites for extraterritorializing asylum, significantly inform the selection of case studies in academic research. This can be perhaps attributed to the desire of academic institutions to influence policy. But it's also driven by the priorities of research programs, which are often financed by the countries implementing migration externalization, and that regard migration research as security knowledge. So as you can see, the uneasy relationship between knowledge production and policy spells out many dilemmas for our research community. Again, the case of Syrian displacement comes to my mind because this is what I have been researching in the last years. There is a dearth of research on places of refuge that have hosted displaced Syrians, but that EU instruments or UNHCR refugee hosting metrics have not particularly highlighted. Take, for instance, Sudan, which has welcomed over 250,000 Syrians in the past 10 years, or the conflict-ridden Gaza Strip, which has been home to approximately 5,000 Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees from Syria. Consider also Tunisia and Bulgaria, where some Syrian communities have chosen to emplace themselves in the light of transnational labor ties. So these locations at first hand may seem misaligned with assumptions and projections. First, places such as Sudan or Gaza are often primarily viewed through a conflict perspective rather than as host destinations. Second, they are viewed as usual hosts for some communities, but not for others. At play here are other factors, including how policy and humanitarian actors draw on the politics of numbers or the size of the refugee group that a country hosts to scale the magnitude of the challenge. So the UNHCR classifies refugee hosting countries according to certain indicators, such as the number of refugees they receive or their income level. The UN Refugee Data Finder highlights certain indicators, certain statistics, certain hosting destinations. Of course, refugee hosting metrics are very important to our research and to humanitarian programs, undoubtedly. But as Ulrike Krause, for instance, argues, numbers construct knowledge and non-knowledge about refuge. They shape what or who through the process of quantification is present or goes missing. So when we look at some maps capturing the scale of the challenge, some destinations are eclipsed, while others are brought into focus. Research has also shown that numbers also influence how salient a refugee destination might become visible for our research agenda. Lebanon, for instance, has received considerable attention as a host for refugees from Syria and Palestine, but there has been minimal research on its policies as a hosting country towards Sudanese and Iraqi refugees. It's also about established labels and categories of ordering in the global migration regime. Praxis-oriented meanings of mobility, migrants versus refugees, mixed migration, modes of ordering through which countries are classified as refugee-producing, refugee-hosting, or affected by internal displacement, make certain destinations at certain temporalities more visible than others. So international organizations such as IOM, UNRWA, or the UNHCR focus on specific refugee groups in certain destinations at certain points in time. So this directs the interests of funders, influences policy activity, and consequently influences research. So examples abound. In Africa, countries like Uganda, Kenya, and Ethiopia are hyper-visible destinations, partly due to the humanitarian order's focus and to their role as hosts for millions of displaced individuals. In a yearly report that you must have read, of course, the Norwegian Refugee Council has shed light on neglected geographies that are overlooked by media, humanitarian funding, and diplomatic efforts. Some of them, such as Cameroon, Niger, or Sudan, are either perceived as conflict zones, refugee-sending countries, or major sites of internal displacement, though they have been hosting refugees from neighboring and faraway countries. So raising awareness on how the infrastructure of policy impacts research on refuge is crucial. I would also like to briefly look at the broader accumulation of knowledge. So we all know that classical academic knowledge rooted in specific worldviews has significantly influenced social science. Fields like critical geopolitics draw attention to the tendency of research grounded in Western empirical contexts to treat certain geographies more as case studies than as foundations for theory building. In our field, a rich knowledge base rooted in Western empirical contexts has informed typologies of asylum and refugee hosting. For instance, political theory that looks at the normative trade-offs between the rights of refugees and state sovereignty has primarily focused on the challenges of liberal democracies and how these polities navigate the tension of balancing border control with the rights of others. This focus is, of course, crucial to understanding the ethics of asylum, no doubt. But as many scholars have already highlighted, this may have obscured knowledge on how post-colonial states negotiate the tension between open borders, hospitality, and the assertion of their sovereignty. An example is how India has negotiated the challenge of refugees and partition. So even if today there's an overproduction of knowledge on the South, destinations that have played an oversized role in refugee hosting, but that have not really complied with international refugee law, choosing instead to develop extra-legal norms, such as charity and generosity, have attracted less attention historically as sites for conceptualizing refuge. The field is, however, highly reflexive and dynamic, and I would like to talk next about the conceptual innovations that have decentered this infrastructure of knowledge and policy. I can't do justice to all of them, but I'm sure that we'll have time in the discussion to expand on the debate. So how has the field shaken these assumptions and sought ways out of these dilemmas? So a growing body of literature has widened our understanding of refugee hosting beyond established and positivist definitions of asylum. That is, asylum seen through a narrow technical focus on how states ascribe legal identity to the incoming others. There's an increasing awareness that our concepts need to capture empirical developments and realities on the ground. Concepts need to grapple with contradictory policy rationalities, ambiguous legal spaces that drive refugee hosting in many parts of the world. Here are some examples. So work has mapped how non-signatory states to the Convention have deeply impacted understandings of asylum. Non-signatory states still enter into memoranda of understandings with the UNHCR, accept at least in rhetoric the principle of non-refoulement, yet increasingly argue that the 1951 Convention does not necessarily reflect their historical challenges. There is furthermore increasing scholarly interest in the politics of hosting in states that offer haphazard asylum. A wide universe of case study research provides a fascinating insight into the localized and empirically grounded understandings of asylum that shape refugees' welfare on an everyday basis. Allow me to provide some examples from a special issue we are editing. Consider the hosting logic of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, a de facto state that receives little attention in literature. So the TR&C, where asylum seekers navigate the unresolved legal terrain of a de facto state, allows us to understand firsthand the range of ambiguities that international refugee law confronts. Consider a totally different example, the Sudanese state, which has opened its borders to Syrians when Lebanon and Jordan closed them in 2014, and which gave some displaced Syrians passports within the first 6 to 9 months. By 2019, the Sudanese state decided to revoke this durable solution. Take Japan, that has cast itself as an unusual asylum destination. but that has at the same time sought to do something in the face of Syrian displacement through small-scale refugee initiatives. So how do these cases broaden our understanding of refuge and asylum? How do they help us capture refugee hosting as a variety of logics and legal and semi-legal spaces? Moreover, research has made strides in bridging the gap between what is perceived to be the core and the periphery. It has particularly questioned this north-south artificial divide in how we study refugee host destinations. It has done so, for instance, by putting places of refuge that offer formal versus informal asylum across the north-south divide in conversation with each other. Some of this work shows how precarity permeates displaced individuals' lives in both signatory and non-signatory states. Scholars have also invited a theoretical inquiry into the politics of refugee hosting beyond the focus on liberal states, bringing, for instance, Middle East states into conversation with liberal democracies as equals in the research design. It's worth noting that invisibilizing certain spaces is not only a consequence of under-researching the South and focusing on the Northern Center. Smaller states within the so-called global North that do not conform to the so-called ideal host state have received less attention. A growing body of scholarship questions this and draws attention to how smaller EU states, such as Malta, Cyprus, Luxembourg, leverage non-material power to center their politics of refugee hosting, and why it's problematic that their politics of hosting goes off the radar in mainstream agenda-setting processes. Let me also emphasize that the important research agenda that has gone beyond the conflation of refuge with durable solutions, as well as with a sense of destination. Here are some notable examples. Important work has delinked the association of durable solutions with the Northern Center as a final destination. So scholars have disrupted biases of how policymakers equate asylum destinations with arrivals to the global North. Places to which displaced individuals initially fled from the Middle East or North Africa were often destinations rather than transit countries. In some cases, refugees preferred settling in challenging refugee destinations rather than seeking to reach Europe in the light of the strong ties and friendships they have developed. Additional examples. Contrary to assumptions that some diasporic Somali communities would want to stay in the North, research shows that some of them make their way to Turkey as a valued moral geography. Even within the global North, displaced individuals may opt to leave supposedly ideal refugee hosting countries. A small-scale interview study with Syrian refugees who have acquired Swedish citizenship but who decided to relocate to the UK shows how policies such as the quick path to naturalization and welfare measures have initially attracted Syrians to Sweden but could not convince them to stay. So interviews stressed here affective ties, affective geographies, and fluid forms of belonging. Challenging the assumption that the West is the preferred destination, scholars keep on exploring why certain destinations are sought after despite their perilousness. Consider the enduring migration corridor from Ethiopia to Yemen, and then ultimately to Saudi Arabia. Many Ethiopians endure deadly journeys through the Arabian Peninsula, and despite Saudi Arabia's restrictive border policies. According to research, whether Yemen ends up being an interim or a final destination for some Ethiopians results from various factors that elude policy assumptions. So refugees' experiences reveal here the limits of policy assumptions about destination choices. They also counter-specialize the hierarchy of preferred destinations. My research in the Middle East shows that refugees revise and update notions of refuge and destination choices. A destination of choice may be seen at the same time a haven and a threat, a temporary or contingent sanctuary in the meanwhile. It's also worth noting that fitting refugees' journeys into patterns following the logic of origin, transit, destination, countries, fails to speak to empirical countries. I'd like also to refer to the Middle East, again, that's historically characterized by porous borders. Displacement involves multiple and repetitive states and forms of dislocation, that it's really difficult to delineate beginnings and endpoints. Internal and cross-border displacement frequently represent intersecting parts of the same narrative, that it's really difficult for practitioners as well as for researchers to speak of durable or final host geographies. At the height of violence in 2013, Syrians in the provinces around Damascus experienced multiple forms of displacement. Some became internally displaced in Syrian towns close to the battlefield, while others fled to the northern neighboring towns in Lebanon. In this context, the speciality of refuge is like a continuum of back and forth journeys towards destinations. In yet another perspective, work has questioned the very conflation of arrival with territoriality. Refugees' resettlement to third countries is not necessarily synonymous with a sense of destination or a sense of satisfaction. Work has even decoupled durable solutions from territoriality altogether. So refugees explore durable solutions by imagining potential futures, revolving around activism or landing a creative job rather than settling in certain physical destinations. A recent study about refugees in Jordan refers to such imagined futures as para-solutions. So rather than speaking about durable solutions and destinations, many practitioners that I have met prefer to work with people-based, place-based solutions, given that one geography of refuge is part and parcel of overlapping and back and forth mobilities and possibilities. I reach now my takeaways. So I suggested in this presentation to probe the messy speciality of world politics and how it positions refugee hosting geographies in the policy and research landscape. I argued for the ongoing need to highlight and reveal how the interests of influential actors and dominant ordering categories entrap our research agenda into certain dilemmas. So what insights might we gain from rethinking the geopolitics of refuge? And how can we persist in finding exits from these dilemmas? Just some initial points for discussion. So the task of pluralizing, broadening, widening perspectives on refuge has many benefits to our field. It enhances, for instance, the comparative method in refugee and forced migration studies, an important cornerstone for theory formation. This can include bringing together case studies that are usually treated separately through the South-North artificial divide, a process Hélène Thiollet refers to as deconfining the field. It's not, however, about over-researching the South here. This is more a call for resisting that our engagement with Southern geographies or South-South contexts follow the imperative of a policy-laden agenda. Instead, it's about engaging with Southern geographies as conceptual, rather than mere physical geographies. Geographies from where we can destabilize subject-object relationships and research designs. It's also about persistently challenging methodological biases in our work, such as seeing like a state, to understand why refugees opt for certain destinations over others. Factors from chance encounters, historical colonial ties, transnational labor ties, the moral appeal of a certain geography or the quest for effective forms of belonging transform certain places unexpectedly into hosting destinations. So by embracing complexity and going beyond methodological nationalism, we can make connections between seemingly unrelated origin and destination points. Widening our repertoire of what refugee hosting destinations look like would enable us here to draw an everyday map of refuge based on refugees' experiences. This requires, of course, going beyond an understanding of displacement as a linear path that determinants of asylum and push and pull factors structure, as several scholars have recently highlighted, including many of you who are with us today, there is both a theoretical and empirical need to explore how and why refugees create their own location choices. This includes how they draw on human agency to self-settle in certain destinations, and what complex structures shape or block their arrival to certain destinations. Such findings inform how refugees and migrants reroute journeys and update destination choices in the face of deterrence measures. In the last years, resource-rich countries in the north have tremendously invested in externalizing and containing migration in the hope that displaced individuals stay afar. Contrary to what policymakers affirm, however, containment does not stop refugees' quest for alternative journeys, alternative futures. It only endangers and blocks them. Displaced individuals may seek less familiar, convoluted, and far from the beaten path routes and destination. In view of this, ensuring safe and regular pathways for refugees and migrants on the move must become top priorities of both the Global Compacts on Migration and Refugees, not only in rhetoric, but also in practice. The aim here is to counter policymakers' assumptions about what qualifies as geographies of transit, final destinations, or first destinations of choice on the policy map. Such assumptions lead to a poor understanding of how both migrants and refugees cast their net wide, crafting their own sense of destination. These policy projections also derail the work of practitioners and organizations who are looking for place-based and everyday beneficiary-led solutions. Finally, a research agenda that privileges an inclusive map-making of refuge helps in countering the tendency to prioritize case studies deemed urgent by the policy sphere and by funding programs. As crises overshadow one another and funding priorities shift from one place of refuge to another, the visibility of refugee destinations waxes and wanes, even though the prolonged displacement of refugees remains unresolved. So by dissociating knowledge production from the hotspot approach, our research community is better equipped to document the vulnerabilities faced by refugees in destinations that are not fully captured by UNHCR metrics and donors, funding instruments, or refugee diplomacy initiatives. Our research community is also better equipped to inform practitioners on beneficiary-led solutions that are place-based, that are experiential. Our interviews with refugee organizations in Lebanon show that the hotspot approach, whereby Lebanon as a host destination has acquired policy visibility during the peak phases of Syrian displacement and has now receded in the background, especially after attention shifted to the issue of displacement from Ukraine. This has had on-the-ground impact on refugee-led organizations' advocacy and programming in several ways. I'd like to mention just a couple of examples to close. For some of the refugee organizations we have been working with, this has led to a feeling of fatigue and distrust in the humanitarian system. This has also led some not to take seriously invitations to events organized by the EU and the UNHCR, such as the Global Refugee Forum or the Brussels Conference, because they know that funding is consistently declining. Others have adapted their advocacy style to pragmatic geopolitical considerations, sadly toning down their original rights-based approach as a strategy of survival. For refugees, this has undoubtedly resulted in a sense of being trapped and forgotten. To close, let me just say that I chose in this presentation and the limited time that I have to unsettle geographies of refuge and to highlight how infrastructures of knowledge and policy cast certain spaces as time-sensitive, critical, or less so, enhancing or reducing their visibility on the global stage. But this is just one perspective out of many. Unpacking the politics of hierarchy in the global refugee regime and the dilemmas that this yields for our everyday lives, advocacy, and research requires, of course, accounting for other lenses, from ethnicity, race, gender, religion, and different conceptualizations and understandings of social justice. I leave this perhaps to the discussion. I'd like to thank you for listening. Once again, a special thank you to the organizers for having me, and I look forward to meeting many of you over the coming days. Thank you.
You can step back a bit. Thank you very much, Maarit. It's 40 to 45 minutes, but I think it's worth it, right? It's a warm-up, a great lecture. I have learned a lot, and I hope we all learn a lot. Thank you for this enlightening perspectives on this complex and, as I said, often overlooked aspect of global refugee. Your insights not only deepen our understanding, but also challenge us to rethink the frameworks through which we view displacement and refugee issues. Thank you. To the audience, we now open the floor for discussion. Unfortunately, I am told we have just 10 minutes for question and answers. So I think, I'm not sure if I'll be able to take more than 2 or 3 questions. Therefore, please make your questions brief. And unfortunately, we don't have a mic around. So if you are asking a question, please try to be as audible as you can. Or you can also come up here and ask your question. Before I open the floor, I'll give myself the privilege to ask one question. That's the privilege of being a moderator. So you touch on various aspects. And one of them is visibility and marginalization of refugees. And my question on that, you have discussed how certain places of refugee are either highlighted or marginalized on the global map. Could you elaborate on what makes certain refugee spaces more visible than others? It's actually a pregnant question, so in journalism, you know. So the other one follows is, whose standards are at play in this process? And how do knowledge and policy infrastructures contribute to this visibility or marginalization?
Thank you so much for your question. I'll try to be very brief. Of course, as I highlighted, this geopolitics of visibility and invisibility can be linked to various aspects. First, the interests of influential actors and the intimate connections between research and policy. You know, refugee spaces become more visible because of practices of extraterritorialization, because they are at the center of gravity, you know, when it comes to policy-making agendas. So I can talk about that for hours, but I do not want to repeat actually the keynote speech. I'd be happy to debate this later during the reception.
Thank you. So how many hands do I see? Yeah, we have you till Wednesday, so we have an ample time. You can catch her before she leaves. She is here. I saw 1 hand, 2, 3. Oda? Okay. So let me give priority to ladies first. Basma? You can stand up so that we see you as well.
me to answer right away? Or?
If you want, I can take another question.
Maybe I'll answer very briefly because this is a fascinating question that I've been really thinking about so much. Actually, because you were living in Lebanon, you know that there is so much awareness raising on extractivism right now, and how, you know, researchers and academics ought to pay attention to this balance, and need also to be cognizant of this extractivist attitude whereby, you know, certain communities and certain refugee organizations become providers of empirical examples, case studies. What I can say is that the community is very aware of that and is trying to, you know, rectify those imbalances, perhaps by including refugee organizations as designers and co-designers of studies, as not only co-designers, but organizations and agents who can actually change the research design. So those were conversations I have been involved in. Unfortunately, reality is that, you know, refugee organizations sometimes prefer to remain invisible because of extractivism and because of crackdowns right now. So some of our recent interviews, as I've just said at the end, you know, have shown that refugee organizations in the Middle East, but also in the world, are navigating this very precarious balance between the politics of visibility and invisibility. Some of them feel that they can be more effective by remaining invisible. And many refugee organizations in Lebanon that were visible back then are now invisible because they want to protect themselves, they want to protect their communities, and they also want to be more effective. Sometimes invisible spaces when it comes to curating communities, organizing events, you know, are thought to be more useful to refugees themselves rather than raising awareness on the global stage. Thank you.
So I've seen Benjamin. Okay, how many hands did I see? Apart from Benjamin, lady in blue, brown, two. That should be enough, right? Okay, so Benjamin, maybe you can just tell us your name. It's just fortunate that I know you and Basma. I pronounce your name, but tell.
Yes, I'm Benjamin, also working for BMBF. We talked about geographies of visibility. I'm a geographer, all beautiful. But I was wondering about the temporality and the chronopolitics involved in all this. So here with some colleagues in the room, we did a research project on protracted displacement crisis, and I see like this huge discrepancy, like in this present-day eventism of what guides migration and asylum politics, what you see now in Germany again. Of course, then the long history of colonialism and resource extraction in the world and all that. We have longer and longer displacement constellations that remain unsolved, and so the history of displacement becomes permanently inscribed in the lives of people who have to report. So can you share a few words, or have you thought about this temporal dimension, which I think we always need to take into consideration?
Of course, thank you so much. This is, of course, a very important question. Because of the limited time, I chose to focus on this aspect of geographies, but of course, temporalities and geographies overlap, so hence the concept of temporal landscapes. I thought about embedding it in my presentation, but maybe I thought that it would be too much, that I won't be able to do justice to all of these overlapping layers of analysis. But as I've just pointed out, some geographies become visible or invisible, you know, in accordance with certain critical junctures, certain temporalities. So here, I think you are right that juxtaposing temporalities and geographies is key to this endeavor that I've just only scratched the surface on. So thank you.
Should I decide or you two decide?
This is a fantastic question, and of course, the discrepancy between UNHCR numbers and real numbers on the ground is a big issue. So, because I have been doing some field research on this lately, some refugee-led organizations are trying, in fact, to find ways, to balance this vagueness and this politics of numbers, because, it's also about providing services. It's about, understanding what's happening on the ground, who goes missing, who goes off the radar. But at the same time, there is this kind of fear of wanting to count refugees and, making it all about the politics of numbers. So I wonder how you navigate this on an everyday basis, because in fact, it is a big issue. As I know you are very familiar with the landscape in Jordan and in Lebanon, where certain, displaced individuals have registered for the with the UNHCR, and others have decided not to or did not want to. So there are various, forms of legal precarity where many go missing. In Lebanon, for instance, some, because they haven't registered or they do not have legal residency, they are just afraid to go out of their locality because there are checkpoints that are set up by municipalities, right? So I can talk a lot about these dilemmas, but I think that it touches to the crux of the matter. How do we navigate between, this politics of numbers and the needs of refugees on the ground? So I'd love to speak to you about that later on.
A bit louder.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that last sentence.
How would you position these migration industries, which we see, which determine the dynamics of many refugee flows? How would you bring that into your map?
Well, I mean, of course, I didn't have the time to talk about all this, and these are all fascinating and very important questions, because I chose to shed light on geographies of visibility and invisibility, but I could have also talked about, these infrastructures that visibilize or invisibilize people and how they are, trapped in those categories and those classification schemes. I think that what we need is a holistic vision, right? A holistic vision tying in temporalities, geographies, infrastructures. I think it's only through this juxtaposition of many variables and many layers of analysis that we are able to understand refugees' vulnerabilities and the various forms of precarity that they go through on an everyday basis.
Thank you so very much. Unfortunately, we're going to close the question session here, and therefore this comes to the end of this session. I think it's a thought-provoking thinking to the many sessions scheduled in the next 2 days that we would be encountering. Unfortunately, we're a bit behind time, but I think still is worth it. On that note, we therefore conclude this session with a call to continued exploration and dialogue on this vital topic. Thank you, dear guests, for listening. Thank you, Tami-Race, for coming. Before we give her a round of applause, I want to say that we are hosting so many panels, including one on meaningful refugee participation. Let me promote my panel a bit. So you guys should join us on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Really interesting to learn more about the German Refugee Advisory Board. On that note, as we give Tami-Race a round of applause, I want us to as well give a round of applause to someone that has been behind this, did so much. I've seen her, how stressful she has been in the office trying to make sure that we're all here today. To the network, but of course, especially Maarit Thank you so very much. In my culture, when we clap, it means it's finished. I am not concluding. Maarit will give you the concluding remarks and tell us what is next. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing the discussion over the reception.
Okay, as I said before, we'll now walk to the old Mayor's Hall, and Konrad will be leading you, so just follow him. As I said, it's a short walk, 3 minutes, and they're waiting there for us, and I'll join you in a minute as well. Thank you.